Welcome back to Sew Happy. In this full sewing tutorial, I'll be making Simplicity 8742, a versatile Mrs. Cardigan pattern that's perfect for layering all year long. This pattern offers two lengths and two different lapel styles, whether you prefer a clean straight front or a flowy cascading look. For my version, I'm sewing view A using a Softshell fabric from Nature's Fabrics. It has a durable water-repellent outer layer and a cozy fleece backing on the inside. It's the ideal combination for a polished yet functional cardigan that can handle cooler weather. Throughout this tutorial, I'll walk you through each construction step so you can confidently sew your own version of this effortless layering piece. Let's get started. Place your front pocket lining right sides together with the front pocket, aligning the top raw edges and pin in place. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance across the top edge, leaving about a 1 inch gap in the center for turning. Then we'll pull down the bottom of the lining to meet the bottom of the pocket. Pin along the side and bottom edge. Sew the side and bottom edges with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to trim the corners and turn the pocket right side out through the opening we left in the top stitches. And I'll use a needle and thread to slip stitch the opening shut. Here's my front bodice piece, and I've marked from the pattern the bottom pocket placement. Place the inside of the pocket onto the right side of the front bodice piece, aligning the bottom edges of the pocket with the markings. Then we'll edge stitch the side and bottom edges of the pocket in place. Repeat to create and attach both front pockets to your front bodice pieces. Here's my front bodice piece once again at the indentation for the collar. For a distance of 1 inch on either side of the point, we're going to mark a line at the seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch. Sew on top of your marked line. Using sharp scissors, snip to but not through the point of your stitches. Repeat for both front bodice pieces. Place your back bodice pieces right sides together and pin the center back seam. Sew the center back seam from top to bottom with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Alternatively, for this seam, if your material does not want to press open flat, you can press your seam allowance to one side as I've done and top stitch from the front. I've top stitched that seam allowance in place from top to bottom with about a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Place your front bodice pieces right sides together and pin the uppermost seam. Sew this seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. You can press the seam open or press it to one side and top stitch as we did for the center back seam. Place the front and back bodice pieces right sides together, aligning the shoulder seams and pin in place. Then we'll sew our shoulder seams from the dots transferred from the pattern piece to the outside edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I've transferred my dart markings from the pattern piece onto the front bodice pieces. Now I'm going to pin them in place. I'll also pin the back neck edges, aligning the center seam. To sew the back neck edge as well as each of the darts, we're going to start sewing from the center with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, pivoting at the dot marking from the pattern piece and continuing to stitch along your dart line to the bottom point, leaving thread tails at the bottom point of the dart so you can tie them in knots. Repeat for the other half of the neck edge and the opposite dart. Place one of your sleeves into its corresponding armhole and pin in place. We're going to sew the sleeve in place twice. First with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, then once more with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Repeat for both sleeves. Here is the sleeve cap of one of my sleeves. To reduce bulk in the underarm seam, we're going to trim away the material from the notches to the outside edge, trimming close to our 1/2 inch seam stitches. Then we'll place our front and back bodice pieces right sides together as well as their sleeves, and pin from the bottom of the sleeve to the bottom of the bodice across that underarm seam. The seam allowance of the sleeve should be pressed toward the sleeve. Sew from the bottom of the sleeve to the bottom of the bodice with one continuous set of stitches with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and repeat on both sides of the garment. Before we hem the bottom of the sleeve and form the cuffs, if the bottom raw edges of your sleeve frays, go ahead and finish those edges. Then we'll fold up the bottom of the sleeve to the wrong side along the fold line transferred from your pattern piece. Pin in place along the raw edge. Once that bottom edge is pinned in place all the way around, sew all the way around to secure this fold. I'm going to be sewing with a 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way around that top raw edge. Then with your sleeve turned right side out, we're going to fold up that bottom edge once more, this time by 3 inches. At the seam and through the topmost layer of the cuff, we're going to sew some stitches to keep that cuff in place. I'm going to place a needle and thread inside the cuff so that the needle comes out the main seam line and through the cuff. Then I'll sew the needle back in close to where it came out. Sewing within that seam will keep those stitches invisible. Repeat that process a few times to secure. Then I'll tie that thread in a knot on the inside. Repeat to create both sleeve cuffs. Here are my facing pieces, and I've stay stitched the inner corners in the same way as we did for the front bodice pieces earlier. Then with sharp scissors once again, I'm going to clip to that stitching point and not beyond. Place these facing pieces right sides together along the topmost edge. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, press the seam open or press to one side and top stitch. Tuck under the back neckline edge to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch. And give that a press. If your material does fray, you'll want to continue down that inner edge to finish those raw edges. Here is my constructed jacket so far and the outer edges of that collar and neckline. Place the outer edges of the facing right sides together with the bodice. Pin matching that center seam down to the bottom edges of the garment. Then we'll sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance from one bottom edge all the way around to the opposite bottom edge. The lower edges and upper edges of the collar will be understitched in 2 different ways. We're going to start with the lower section of the front jacket. Turn that facing over its seam allowance and mark where the notch is. We're going to start our understitching for this lower section 3 inches below that notch. Sewing the facing to the seam allowance underneath with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. From our marking to the bottom of the jacket, repeat on both sides. So here is the marking where my notch is. I'm going to make another mark 3 inches above the notch. And I'll mark the same point on the other side. This is where the second set of understitching will stop and start. And we're going to sew that outer material to the seam allowance underneath. From one marking around the top of the facing to the opposite marking that we just made with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Here is the main neckline seam pressed up toward the facing on the inside of the jacket. Place the neckline seam of the facing that you pressed under by 5/8 of an inch on top of the main stitching line. I'm going to pin this pressed edge in place, aligning that center seam, pinning from the outside of the garment. Now that I have that inner pressed edge secured on the inside, pinning from the outside, I'm going to stitch in the ditch from seam to seam, securing that inner folded edge. So now on the inside of the jacket, below the seam that we just sewed to attach the inner edge of the facing, you have some seam allowance remaining below the area that we clipped into earlier. I'm going to sew this raw edge to the seam allowance of the shoulder seam of the main jacket underneath. Repeating on both sides. The hem allowance for the bottom of the jacket is 1 1/4 inches. We're going to start by hemming the facing. Turn the facing to the right side along the main seam line. I'll pin the bottom edge of the facing in place. And repeat on both sides. Sew both lower edges of the facings with a 1 1/4 inch seam allowance horizontally. Then we'll trim away some of the material at that lower edge of the facing within the seam allowance that we just created, starting about 5/8 of an inch away from the innermost edge, all the way to the outer edge. Repeat on both sides. Then we can turn our facings right side out, poking out the bottom corners. Finish the remainder of the bottom edges in your preferred method if the material frays. Then we're going to fold up the bottom edge to the wrong side by the hem allowance of 1 1/4 inches and pin in place. Now you can slip stitch or blind hem stitch that bottom hem all the way across the upper edge. Alternatively, you could just sew across the bottom edge with the traditional visible hem. And now the jacket is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.